Daf Pei Gimel Amud Beis will begin Daf Pei Gimel Amud Aleph, 10 lines from the bottom of Masechet. We learned previously, Rav Yitzchak's din, that the bones that serve the noiser, that they have a din of noiser themselves. That at Samas Kadshim, Sheshimu noiser, they're Matamas Yadayim, they have a din of noiser. So therefore, if you have marrow bones, and the marrow became nicer, it was left over beyond the time limit, and it has a different nicer, it has to be burnt. The bones, they're meshamish the nicer, they serve the nicer, they're a basis, a base for the nicer. They also have a din of nicer, and they also have to be burnt. And the Stasis in Chulin says that means even if the marrow has been removed, but once there's a din of nicer on the bones, it remains, and even if the marrow has been removed, you have to burn them. That was Rav Yitzchak's din. Masechet, the Gemara asks a kasha. We learned in the Brisa, Kol Atzamos HaKadoshim HaKadshim Ein Tun Sreif. It says that the bones of all other korbanos do not require sreifa. Chutz me'atzamos HaPesach. Except the exception is the bones of the Korban Pesach, Mibnei HaTakola. They have to be burned because there's a takola, potential takola mishap, because there's an isser on the bones of Pesach, etzem le'sishru boy. He can't break the bone, so therefore we say that it should be burnt. So, what's the case of these bones? If there's no marrow in the bones, then why should they be burnt? There's no din to burn the bones, it's only on account of the meat and the marrow that you'd have to burn it. If they're not marrow bones, why do you have to burn them? Elapshita disbu moyach must be that there is marrow. V'isal kadaitach shimush nicer milsa. Now, if you tell me that shimush, like Rav Yitzchak says, shimush nicer is milsa, and therefore there's a din of sreifa on the bones, asmais kadoshim amai ein tunim sreifa. Why should the bones of other kachim not have to be burned? They should also have to be burned. If we say that the shimush of the nicer is milsa, then what's the difference between a Korban Pesach and other korbanos? Then we should say there's a din of nicer on the bones and they have to be burned. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, he answers, he says, what are we dealing with here? Where he found the bones and they were broken open, they were emptied, and they don't have any marrow in them. So they're emptied of the marrow. Atzmas Kadshim, the bones of other Kadshim, and there's no issur to break the bone. Therefore, we can assume that we can assume, therefore, that when were they broken open? There's no issur to break the bones, so when were they broken open? Must be before they were nicer. We would assume that the person was not allowed to become nicer, so we can assume, therefore, they were broken beforehand, and they never became nicer. And therefore, there was never shimush nicer, and they therefore don't have to be burned. But Atzmas HaPesach, by the Korban Pesach, that they have an isser of shviras ha'etzem, there is an isser to break the bone. So we would have to assume, therefore, lebasud and have a nicer the chaltzino. We would assume, therefore, that he did not break the bone beforehand because there was an isser of breaking the bone. Now, as Rashi explains, we're going here according to Rav Shimon that says the isser of etzem le'sishbru boy does not apply after it becomes also, after it's the isser applied. So therefore, by the Korban Pesach, we would assume, well, there's an isser of etzem le'sishbru boy. He would have not have broken the bone beforehand. Therefore, it became nicer. And we would say, Labasa didn't have a nicer de chaltzina. He only broke it afterwards, where it was nicer, where there's no isser breaking the bone. And however, the marrow was nicer, and the bone became nicer, and therefore it requires sreifa. That's the difference between them. The difference between them is not that there is no shimush of the nicer, and the bones don't become nicer by other korbanos, except that we would assume over there that he removed the marrow before it became nicer, because there's no isser of etzem le'sishbru boy, and therefore it never had a status of shimush of nicer. Rasvira, he gives a different teretz. What are we dealing with here? Kigain, Shamason, Svarim. he found piles. They found it in piles. Umehen chalutz. And on the top one, he checked them, and he saw it on the top one that they were emptied out of the marrow. Now, he didn't examine the whole pile, but he examined the top ones, and he saw that they were removed of the marrow. So we say as follows: Atzma is kadoshim, the bones of other korbanos dein b'em mishmishras ha'etzem, where there's no isser of breaking the bone, it's not applicable. So then we would say lekula avachals levachalu. We would assume, therefore, though, just like the upper ones, the top one on top, he examined them and he saw that they were emptied out of the marrow. We would assume that the ones at the bottom, that's the same case. We would assume, therefore, that there was no marrow, and therefore that they were never shimish of nicer boys reifa, and therefore they don't have to be burnt. But atzmos of Pesach, the bones of the Korban Pesach, the yeshmem shmashir, where there is an isser of breaking the bone. Dilma hani de chalzino l'hanach lechalzino. Perhaps we would say that only these he broke; he didn't break the other ones because there's an isser. Ubois reifa, and therefore we would say that we would have to be chayshish that the ones on the bottom, therefore, were not removed from the marrow, and therefore they were shimish of nicer, and they have to be burnt. Now Rashi explains the difference between the two terutzim. The nafkamina is that we're saying in this latter teretz over here that he didn't check the bottom ones. But if he had checked the bottom ones, and he saw that they were emptied out of the marrow, if he had checked them out, then the Rashi says, the Mashmo says over here that, according to Rosid, he would not have to burn them. And since this is a case of Shimish Noiser, we are not going to be we're not so machmir with Shimish Noiser to say, therefore, that they would have to be burned. According to Rosid, he says, if you didn't check them, then we have to be chayshish that the bones on the bottom were not emptied out of the marrow, rather, because we would say there's an isser of etzem tishbro. So me'echatesi, why would we assume that he emptied out the marrow? But if he did check it out, if he did examine them, and he saw that the marrow was removed, now it's only a question of when it was removed, before it became nicer, after it became nicer. According to Razvid, you don't have to burn the bones because we won't assume that they were removed after it became nicer. Now the Mashal explains it as follows. As we explained previously, Rashi says that we were talking previously that Rav Nachman held that like Rav Shimon, and therefore he said the Isser breaking the bone, Rav Shimon holds of Isser breaking the bone is only before it became nicer, not after nicer. So therefore, in the previous teretz that we learned, Rav Nachman by Yitzchak said that the Isser Shir Etzem applies by Pesach, so therefore we would assume, therefore, that it was only emptied out, the marrow was only emptied out after it became nicer, and therefore the shimush of nicer and the bones have to be burnt. Now Rashi explained that that's going according to Rishimon, so therefore if he has a choice of if he's going to break the bone before or after, we would assume that he broke it only after it was nicer, where there's no Isser. But the Maharsha explains, but according to Razvid, he's going according to Rav Yaakov, that the Isser of Etzem Leisishbo applies both before and after. And therefore, in any event, there would have been an Isser of breaking the bone. So therefore, there's no reason to assume necessarily that he broke it after it became nicer, because the Isser applies in both cases. So therefore, we say that if he did not examine it, then since there's an Isser of Etzem Leisishbo, then we would therefore have to be concerned that the marrow is not removed, and therefore it was a shimush of nicer and has to be burnt. But if we examine it all, and once we see that it's all examined, and therefore there's no marrow, then the issue is, was it removed before or after? Well, over here we will not be machmir to say, therefore we have to be concerned that it was necessarily removed only after it was nicer. So therefore, according to Razid, if you did examine it, and he examined the pile, and there was no marrow, we don't have to burn the bones, because we won't have to be concerned that it was necessarily removed only after it became nicer. More now comes to a new discussion. All of the sinews are considered meat. They're considered basar, and therefore they're part of the. You can be yotze with the achil of the korban pesach with them, and they can be included in the chabura if there's enough meat, which you would had to have a kazayas, including the gidin. Then that would be you can be mitzdarif in the chabura. They're considered basar. Except the gidim and the neck, which are considered hard, are not considered food, and therefore that's not considered the basar of the korban pesach, and you can't be yotze with that, with those gidim. Tonight we learned in the Mishnah, it says that the bones and the gidim and noiser have to be burnt on the 16th. What are these gidim? What are these gidim? What's the situation with these gidim? If you tell me that they're regular gidden and it's regular basar, so why do you have to burn it? Eat them. And if you tell me that they were left over, that's a regular case of nicer. Nicer is basar that was left over. Then this is also basar that was left over. So what it must be that it's not considered to be regular basar. It must be the girma of the neck. And it's listed separately because people don't eat it. And we know right from the beginning that they're not going to be eaten because it's not, people don't eat it. And therefore, the Tana is telling us they're burnt on the 16th. Now, if you tell me that, even though people don't eat it, but it has halacha basar, then I understand. Then I understand that's why they have to be burnt, because they have a din of basar. The din of naisar is basar that you're supposed to eat, and don't leave over that basar to the next day. And if you do, you have to burn it. So we understand that this can have a din of naisar and has to be burnt. But if you tell me that it doesn't have a halacha of basar, lama lu sreifa, why do they have to be burnt? There's no din naisar on them. So doesn't this show you, not like you were saying, like Rav Yehuda Marav was saying, doesn't this show you that the gidei tzavar are considered basar? The one says no. It's talking about the gid hanosha, and now gid hanosha is also bachila. But we're going by a little bit Rav Yehuda. Sanya Rav Yehuda, he says einonai el ba'achas, that it doesn't apply to the gidim on both legs; it's only on one of them. Das machras shel yamin, and the das machras, it's reasonable to say, now we'll see what that means in a moment, that just means that the das is machras, machria, that shel yamin, it's on the right leg. So therefore, it's as follows, that the right leg is also bachila. There'll be no din noiser. But the left one perhaps is also and perhaps is not. Now, if we treat this as a suffix, we would understand it as follows: that it is a suffix, it's only on one of them, but we don't know which one it applies. The one that is also, there's no din noiser because you can't eat it. The one which is mutter, it's mutter, and there's a din of noiser. But if we don't know which one, he's not eating either of them. Misafek, he's not going to eat either of them, and therefore one of them is really edible, is really mutter, is really basar, and therefore there's a din of noiser, and it has to be burnt. So therefore, it mentions the gid, and we're talking about the gid hanosha. So, well, therefore, if you explain it that way, let's be poished from that Rav Yehuda has a suffix. Now, the Gemara in Chulin it questions when Rav Yehuda says that the das is machras, that is yamin, does it mean das taira, and therefore it's not a suffix? He means to say that is the das taira, and therefore the yamin, the right one, is also the left is mutter. Or does he mean, no, not das taira, he means that our das is machras, that mistoma, it is the right, but it's a suffix. Now, according to this explanation, it fits in if it's a suffix, but we're not sure if Rav Yehuda meant a suffix. So let us therefore say that it only fits in if you say that it's a suffix. But if it's a vadai, and it means the das, that the das, the machras, the das taira, then it's not a suffix, then the left one, it should be mutter, let him eat it. So, relative should the sukim masafteler yuradim mishap pshitale, because if it's partial that it's only the right one and not the left, then eat the one of mutter, and the right one, then don't eat it. Lama l'streifa, nothing has to be burnt in that case. Ama Ravi Kabarachina, no, he says, no, really, I'll tell you, it could have been going if it's a vada. It's the right one, which is also, and therefore the right one is discarded. The left one could be eaten, but they got mixed together. So he doesn't know which is which. He doesn't know which is the right and which is the left, and therefore he can't eat either of them, and one of them becomes nicer and is burnt. Rav Ashi Omri says, a variation, it says, it's talking about the fat that's covering the giranasha, not the giranasha itself. The Thanya, we learned the Bride says, Shamna mutter min ikradim and atayra, the fat surrounding the gid is mutter, v'Yisrael kedashim heim v'noigim by Isser. But Yisrael are kedashim and they're noig with it in Isser. So it's a minig not to eat it. So therefore, the Tana lists it separately, that really it could be eaten. But since from the outset they're not going to eat it because the minig is not to eat it, so it's not like regular basar that became nicer. It's something that from the outset they're not going to eat it, and therefore it's destined to be burnt. Ravina Mara Bechitzan. It's dealing with the outer gid. There are two gidim. The inner one, meaning the one that's facing the other thigh. So that one is awesome. And that's awesome in a Torah, and there's a Chiv Malkus, that's where the Torah Asr one. But Chitza in the outer one, the one that's facing away, is facing the air on the outside of the body, not facing the inner thigh. Chitza and a Samach Lebasar, which runs along the basar, also. It's also, but that's only midrabanan, ve'ein chayav alav, and you're not chayav. That's also midrabanan. So again, it's the same idea that minat Torah it's mutter, but since midrabanan it's also, it's destined from the outset not to be eaten. So it's not like regular nicer, but midrabanan it's also, so he's not going to eat it. So therefore, it's burnt. So there's a chilik between the two tirutzim. And it's mashma from the Rambam that Ravina argues with Rav Ashi because he says the shuman of the gid, the fat that covers the gid, that's only in the minig. And since they only refrain from eating it of a minig, there's a mitzvah of eating the korban pesach would be doich that. So therefore he brings the case over here where it's a full-fledged isur d'Rabbanan, and therefore he doesn't eat it, it's not eaten, and therefore it's destined to be burnt. Sagt die Gemara weiter, she shows if the 16th fell on Shabbos, then we don't burn it on the 16th. We have to wait till the next day, and then the nicer is burned on the 17th. Why does the Mishnah say that the burning of the nicer is not Deicha Yontiv and it's not Deicha Shabbos? Why is that? And they say, why don't we say that the essay of burning the nicer, that the Torah says that what's left over be'esh tisreifa should be burnt? It's a mitzvah essay. Why is it not Deicha? The lois haseh of Meloch on Yontiv. Amr Chizkiah v'chein Tana debei Chizkiah. Amr Kra, the pasuk says, "Lo yisir mimeno ad boiker." V'hanayser mimeno ad boiker. So there's an extra mention of the word boiker. The boiker is mentioned twice. So it says that which is left over to the boiker be'esh tisreifu. She'ein Talmud loymar ad boiker. It doesn't have to say the boiker a second time. Ma Talmud loymar ad boiker. So why does it say the second time? Litin loy boiker she'ein is trifasa, to teach you that it's not burnt on the first morning. It's pushed off to the second morning. The first morning, so the basar, the korban pesach here, makriv on the 14th. It's eaten on the night, the 15th, which is yontiv, and therefore it says a second biker. Don't burn it on the morning of the 15th because that's yontiv. It's not deicha yontiv. You have to push it off to the next morning, which is the 16th, which is chol hamoed. Why can't you burn it? Why do you have to push it off to the morning? Why not burn it at night? That's already, and the night prior is already not Yom Tov. Tosfos explains because you don't burn kachim at night, so therefore it's pushed off to the 16th, which is Chol Hamoed. Abaye Amar, a different makor, Amar Kra Oilas Shabbos b'Shabbat. You're makriv the korban oil of a Shabbos on Shabbos. What are you makriv on Shabbos? The korban of Shabbos. So therefore, medayek beloy oilas chol b'Shabbos. Only the korban of Shabbos on Shabbos, but not on oilas chol on Shabbos. Oilas chol b'yontiv. So therefore, this tells you that we don't apply the regular din of esay deicha because there's a special limit over here that this is an exception. Rava Amar, a different makor, he says Amar Kro hu levadoi ye'asalachem. On Yontiv, what can you do on Yontiv? Only this. That only this can be done with need for oichel nefesh. So who v'loy machshirav? It's only this, the oichel nefesh itself, and not the machshirim. You can't make the kalim, the utensils that are needed in the preparation of the food. It's the preparation of the food, but not the machshirim that enable you to prepare the food. So who v'loy machshir? So machshirim that you could have done from beforehand, these machshirim are not doicha yontiv. Levadoi only it v'loy mila shalei bezmana. Mila shalei bezmana is not doicha yontiv or Shabbos. Abon mi kal v'chaymer, because you would have made a kal v'chaymer to say that mila should be doicha, and therefore we have this limud to teach you that it's not doicha. Because I would have made a kal v'chaymer as follows. I would have said that tzaras is doicha avoda, and if the kohen has a tzaras, he can't do the avoda, and you don't cut it off. It's doicha avoda, and avoda is doicha Shabbos. So, and it's the avoda is doicha Shabbos. So mila is doicha, but mila is doicha tzaras, and even a mila shalei b'zman is doicha tzaras. That if there's a tzaras b'malka mila, you don't cut it off. So therefore, I should say that if that's the case, certainly that mila should be doicha. That should be doicha Shabbos. Madach is doicha tzaras, and tzaras is doicha avoda, which is doicha Shabbos. So mila, even shalei b'zmana, should be doicha Shabbos. That's why I have this limud. Rav Ashi Amar, he says, a different limud Shabbosan, the Yontav Eseu. It's not a question of Eseu Deicha Lois Hasei, because on Yontav there's not only a Lois Hasei of doing Malacha, there's also a mitzvah's essay to not to do Malacha, to be Shavis, to rest on the day. Shabbosan Yontav Eseu, it's an essay, Ve'in Eseu Deicha Lois Hasei essay, and an essay, the essay of burning the Naisar cannot be Daicha Yontiv, which is both an essay and a Lois Hasei, and therefore it has to be pushed off to the next day.